Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished and respected author from Tennessee, USA, Mr. Edward Bjurstrom. Edward, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thank you. Edward is the author of a book titled The Success Guide: How to Thrive in the Corporate Environment. So, Edward, my first question for you: what gap did you see in existing leadership and performance books that motivated you to write the Success Guide?
Well, there's a lot of books out there that'll tell you, what to do as a leader. What I was really interested is trying to explain how to do the right things.
Hmm.
I think that's the distinctive of the book, and it's kind of guided my thinking all during the writing process. I wanted to make a practical and useful guide for people. Maybe they'd make less mistakes than I made in my
Hmm.
career.
Hmm. Hmm. And before we go a little further, tell me a little bit about your own journey.
Yeah, I spent 40 years in the biopharmaceutical industry. For about 7 years, I had my own consulting business, which gave me the opportunity to see a lot of different companies, how they worked, how their teams were formed, and some of the challenges and difficulties that they faced.
Hmm. Hmm.
I also had the opportunity to run an operation in Puerto Rico for a couple of years,
Hmm.
which gave me an insight into different culture. Learned to speak Spanish while I was there, and that was a window into actually how people who speak Spanish think.
Hmm.
And it's different. It's represents their mindset and
Sure.
approach to many
Hmm.
things.
Hmm. Well said. Back to your book now. You emphasize thriving rather than surviving in corporate life. What is the key difference between the two? And give me an example if you can.
Oh, sure. Human beings are really designed to survive.
Hmm.
In the book, I talk about how you have two minds: your rational mind and your emotional mind.
Yeah.
The emotional mind is really the subconscious. It's the thing that's below the surface of your conscious awareness, which, by the way, governs, 85 to 95% of everything that you're doing every day. You don't think about chewing gum or walking.
Hmm.
You just do those things naturally, and your conscious mind is freed up to be aware of what's happening around you.
Hmm.
In the survival mode, people are really defensive. They're focused on trying to avoid threats and difficulties. Whereas thriving, you're more engaged with people. You're looking for opportunities to succeed. And, so people are too much in the survival mode. And it's really negatively oriented. Where if you're thinking of thriving, building, and growing, then it's
Hmm.
definitely much more positive.
Hmm. Great response. You write that mindset shapes everything from decision making to leadership effectiveness. How can leaders begin to recognize their own unhelpful thinking patterns?
Yeah, mindset is really all about how you deal with setbacks and challenges, failures and difficulties. And, the key is really to understand those situations as learning opportunities,
Hmm.
and an opportunity to grow and to build your skills. That's called a growth mindset. And, by comparison, the opposite is a fixed mindset, which tries to avoid problems and difficulties.
Yeah.
And wants to control everything rather than learn from it.
Hmm.
And even if someone with a growth mindset gets some challenging feedback, they see it as a gift and an opportunity to see places they could change and do better.
Hmm.
Whereas a fixed mindset will take um, good critical feedback as a judgment,
Hmm.
and usually reject it and not make good use of
Yeah. Yeah. And why is emotional intelligence especially critical in highly regulated and high pressure industries?
it. Yeah, emotional intelligence is, kind of a fancy new way to describe emotional maturity.
Correct.
And, in a high pressure situation, the real key is to not get hijacked by your emotional mind and just simply react to the situation.
Mm,
Instead, what you really need to do is to thoughtfully respond
mm.
and stay calm, especially when the stakes are high.
Yeah.
It's really damaging in order if you end up, just having your emotions run away with you.
Mm, mm. My next question is, how do stress and uncertainty change the way leaders think and behave, often without realizing it?
Yeah, that goes back to, the idea of being emotionally mature. You know, it, leaders need to stay calm in challenging circumstances. And being a leader, I mean, a leader is the one who's trying to set the tone for his people,
Mm,
his or her people. And so, um, being able to be thoughtful and calm in those circumstances is a critical element of leadership.
mm. Many leaders believe competence alone is enough. What does your experience say about the limits of technical excellence without self awareness? And give me an example.
Yeah, yeah. I I've hired lots of people in my 40-year career, and unfortunately, I've encountered a number of people who are profoundly lacking in self-awareness.
Correct.
So what happens is they end up damaging relationships and destroying trust without even realizing it. And so you know, they were technical experts. I mean, the whole hiring process, I write about that in the book, is you can't just focus on technical ability, the written resume that comes through that actually is the sort of the gating element for even why you would call somebody and bring them in for an interview. What
Mm,
you really want to understand is how emotionally mature are they? As I said, I've hired lots of really smart people,
yeah.
a few that were profoundly lacking in self-awareness. And unfortunately, they caused so much disruption. I had to ask them to go work somewhere else and be successful
Mm,
somewhere else.
very interesting. Edward, distraction is a major challenge today. What strategies from your book can help professionals to regain focus and achieve flow?
Yeah. Well, we since about 2007, when the iPhone came out, and now everybody has a computer in their pocket, we're constantly bombarded by not just information, but
Mm,
distractions,
mm,
notifications, emails pop up on your computer. And so I kind of categorize it as either internal distractions or external distractions.
mm,
Internal is, you're tempted to look at your email, 10 times a day. You
mm,
should limit that to maybe only one or two times a day. When you want to do focused work, you need to turn off all your notifications,
mm,
close your email, close your door if you have an office, hang a sign out, do not disturb,
mm,
so that you can actually really focus on your work
mm,
without interruptions from, externally, and you
mm.
need to manage those potential distractions internally.
Yeah.
External distractions are like the boss comes by
Mm,
or your colleague wants to, ask you a question. So you really need to protect that time
yeah.
so you can really focus and really get into this mental state called flow, which
Mm,
is a very powerful, creative state. You've increased pattern recognition, increased creativity, and you can get many hours of work done in, just an hour and a half or 2 hours.
mm. I love your suggestion that, close your door, put do not disturb, and then think, and maybe that'll help, your flow to come back. But Edward, how realistic is it for people in demanding corporate roles to experience this mode of flow on an ongoing basis or regularly?
Well, it's a matter of discipline, I think. A whole lot of senior leaders are someone else controls their entire schedule if they let them.
Mm,
Everybody wants to talk to them. There's no end to the meetings that they want to be invited to. And so it's really an issue of carving out some time
Hmm.
that you can protect and defend and make sure that you can get your own significant work done.
Yeah.
Huge number of senior leaders are, thinking that meetings, for example, are mostly a waste of time.
Mm.
They actually can be very exciting and interesting, but they need to have a real purpose. And,
Mm.
just handing your entire schedule over to, all the people around you will make sure you never have an opportunity to stay
Mm.
focused.
Mm. Amazing. We've spoken about flow, and my next question is on listening. And listening is often underestimated. What does effective listening actually look like in a high performing team?
Well, in any conversation between two people, the first thing is, um, you have to resist the temptation to start formulating your own response
Mm.
while the other person is speaking.
Mm.
You need to listen to understand. That's number one. And in the context of a team, that opportunity for listening intently for understanding is really critical because teams get together for a whole variety of reasons,
Mm.
most often for addressing issues, problems, and working together to create something that needs to be addressed.
Mm.
And, that idea of listening to your colleagues, not to rebut them or confuse the situation, but to build on it to understand. This is, dialogue. And
Mm.
a lot of times in a team setting, people will have different ideas about what the problem is that they're trying to
Mm.
work on.
Mm.
And until you actually spend some time dialoguing about what the problem is
Yeah.
and get everybody's perspective, you really aren't sure how to proceed. And a big mistake is a lot of people will go into discussion to figure out a solution
Mm.
before they've agreed on what the problem is.
Mm. Amazing. Many meetings drain energy rather than create alignment. What practical changes do you recommend in your book?
Well, one of the real keys is the leader of the meeting, the team leader, whoever is leading facilitating the meeting. That's
Mm.
actually a skill that needs to be nurtured and cultured and developed. And
Mm.
what that means is that you make sure that everybody has an opportunity to contribute. And, some people are extroverts and they want to dominate the conversation.
Mm.
And the facilitator needs to manage that, whether it's the team leader, the boss, or whatever. And some people are just shy, they're introverts. They have great ideas, but unless somebody asks them, they're not likely to speak up. And so
Right.
the facilitator needs to actually engage, invite them to speak and, start a meeting and make sure everybody knows the expectations are everybody participates, everybody contributes
Mm.
their best thinking. And one really interesting aspect of a really great meeting is you want to invite disagreement. That might be
Mm.
surprising, but when people are engaged and don't agree on something, they speak honestly
Yeah.
and enthusiastically, and it makes it actually a very exciting meeting and an opportunity to really define what needs to get done. And the facilitator needs to manage that carefully
Mm.
so that it doesn't get out of control. But it's not something to be feared or worried about.
Mm. Well said. Can you explain the value stack framework and why is it central to trust-based leadership?
Yeah, I talk about the value stacker. It's it starts off with trying to define the vision of your organization, and that's really where you want to go.
Mm.
And it needs to be aspirational and inspiring to the people in the organization. Okay, and there are important elements in this values vision stack. You got the vision, where you're going. Um, you have to have values so that they define your behavioral norms,
Mm.
so that everybody understands how they're expected to behave. You have strategy,
Mm.
which is going to define how you get where your vision wants to go. And
Mm.
you need your mission, that's your purpose, and And usually that's a very succinct and well-defined
Mm,
element. And of
mm,
course, after that, you've got, annual goals and things. But why it's important is if everybody understands where you're going and how you're going to get there, how to
mhm,
behave in the process, then you get alignment across departments and different organizations. And also, you build trust. Um, the idea is you want everybody to have clarity on where you're going and why it's important.
mm,
And because it's an aspirational effort, people are, engaged. They realize that their careers can grow and that the work that they're doing is
mm.
important. Working in the pharmaceutical business, it's always been a blessing because
Yeah.
making life-saving drugs that changes people's lives was very engaging and encouraging, and people worked with their heart, not just their hands.
Well said. How can leaders maintain integrity and results at the same time, especially under regulatory pressure?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, in a highly regulated industry like pharma or, other things,
Mm,
healthcare, airplane parts and different things. You have a lot of regulations. And to be successful, you absolutely need integrity.
yeah.
I'll give you one example. I've had to unfortunately let some people go who demonstrated a lack of integrity. And, the HR crowd was, questioning me. Well, maybe they made a mistake. Maybe they didn't mean it. Are you sure you really want to fire this person?
Mm,
I explained to them, no, they consciously tried to hide their mistake. They, lied about it. And so I asked them this question. If one of your loved ones needed a drug that was important to their life, wouldn't you want to have it be made by someone you could trust?
mm. Wow. How should leaders think about decision making when the stakes are high and the margin for error is small?
Yeah, that's a challenge. A lot of times, you know, different people will have the experience where you kind of go into emergency mode.
Mm,
Let's say there's a serious problem that's maybe threatening, the team or even the plant or your organization.
yeah.
And you go into emergency mode, and the stakes are high, the margin of error is small, and you really have to get good work done in a short period of time.
Mm,
And in those situations, people behave very differently than normal. They check their ego at the door, all their petty disagreements disappear. They, absolutely resist distractions. They focus on the work. They work together as a team,
mm.
unified, and they get great work done.
Yeah.
And then when it's all done like that, they hand it off to people to implement whatever they developed.
Mm,
They ask themselves, why do we need an emergency to work so well together? So,
mm.
the opportunity is there
Correct.
to not have that need to be an emergency.
Mm, very interesting. What distinguishes leaders who scale successfully from those who struggle as their organizations grow?
Hmm. Yeah. So how can you scale? What you really need is you need uh, effective delegation, which brings along some autonomy and
Mhm,
trust.
mhm,
And so if you've built an environment of trust where people understand together where they're trying to go,
mhm,
even in their own particular area, you give them the autonomy to function and do their work as they understand, and you
mhm.
put good people in place. You can trust them to actually do the right thing,
Yeah.
and you don't need to micromanage. Now, it doesn't mean that the leader's not involved.
Mm,
The leader needs to do check-ins to make sure that he lets his people know or her people know that uh, he's a resource
mm.
for them and that he cares about their success.
Yeah.
And, a lot of times people will make the mistake of not seeing their boss or their leader as the resource that they need to be.
Mm. Wow. Time for two more questions for you, Edward. How has working across different cultures, particularly Puerto Rico, reshaped your view on leadership?
Yeah, it was a bit of a culture shock going from California to Puerto Rico. The It's wonderful people in Puerto Rico,
Mm,
very warm and friendly. They have their own way to do things. When I
mm,
arrived there, the facility was not in good shape. I had to actually let some of the senior leaders go for a variety of reasons, and that made it kind of difficult at the beginning.
mm, mm.
But over time, I was keenly aware of the need to build trust
Yeah.
and to demonstrate in meaningful ways to the people in the facility
Mm,
that I really cared about them. And I
mm,
was able to do a number of things that was meaningful and important, and demonstrated that I cared about them, and that the changes that I was making was for the facility to continue to be successful, and that their future careers would be ensured.
mm.
By the time I left, they gave me a big party and were very
Yeah.
sad to see me go.
I know. My last question for you, Edward. For viewers and listeners who want to start immediately, what, in your view, is one action they can take this week to begin thriving rather than just surviving?
Great question. The one of the important things is to learn how to ask good questions.
Mm,
Okay, ask good questions to understand.
mm,
Don't just react. You might be tempted to just react to a certain situation, but ask a curious question, a good
mm,
question like, you know, why do you think that?
mm.
Help me understand. Or really a couple of good ones to, be able to start to engage dialogue
Hmm.
and get to know what people are thinking. You have your point of view, so you might actually just need to suspend your point of view for a minute
Yeah.
and go over and try to see things from their point of view.
Hmm. And on that note, Edward, I just want to say what a fascinating conversation this has been. Talking to you about your book, The Success Guide: How to Thrive in the Corporate Environment. We covered some very interesting ground, almost like a 101 on leadership and thriving in the corporate world. Thank you again for speaking to me, and good luck to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.